That episode I made earlier in the day, which is now the previous episode, the episode previous to this one, has, prompted another thought. So I'll have that other thought. That episode actually got chopped off unceremoniously, as plenty of my episodes do, when the phone goes flat or for some other reason. I don't get into editing. You get it as it goes, and sometimes it goes badly. At the end of that, I was I was drawing an analogy. The Pearl Fishers, that's an opera, and it's set in Sri Lanka, and it's written by a Frenchman who seems to not really know a hell of a lot about Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's gods and all that sort of thing, as far as I can see. I don't know whether he ever went there, but he wrote an opera about some pearl fishers in Sri Lanka, and there were people in the pearl fishing community whose job it was to appease the gods and to ward off evil spirits, to keep the pearl fishers to keep the pearl fishers safe. So I likened that to those guys being health and safety officers in a workplace in a different context than we are used to, because that was what they were all about. The safety of the pearl fishers. And there were a whole lot of other people, other than the actual pearl fishers themselves, in that working community, whose job it was to keep the pearl fishers safe. And the way to do that in those days was to appease the gods and to ward off evil spirits, which might whip up storms and sink boats and drown pearl fishers and so on. Now, and in that episode I made, I somewhat mused that these health and safety officers, workplace safety officers at that time, were not that different to us in our time. They were operating on hard evidence as they saw it. They were looking at the data of their time, and the data was telling them, hard data, evidence-based health and safety, hard data concerning what was causing workplace accidents and workplace death too. So sometimes, a storm would come and pearl fishers would die. People in the workplace would die. Just like as happens now, sometimes someone in your workplace dies on a building site or whatever. Okay, so this is no different. And they looked at all the data, they collected all the data, and the data told them that it was the gods doing this, whipping up storms and things like that, and making accidents happen and so on and so forth. And so they were putting in place controls to do something about these risks. And the controls were, for example, to sacrifice a virgin. It's an oldie but a goodie. People used to love doing that sort of stuff. So there was a young girl in the show who had to give up her life, basically, to appease the gods for workplace safety. Now, it happened to be, some sort of fake Sri Lanka where they didn't actually kill her, but she was still sacrificing herself. in a different way, and I explained all of that. Look, in other cultures, they would actually kill the girl physically, but this girl was, she had to sacrifice herself in as much as she wasn't allowed to have her face wasn't allowed to be shown in public. She wasn't allowed to have any friends and all that sort of stuff. She could never take a lover or a husband or anything like that. She had to sacrifice herself. So it's a variation on the same theme that you see in other cultures back then, and probably now in some places, where to really keep the gods happy and to keep the workplace safe, you sacrifice a virgin. Okay, and the priests were, always supported this idea because it was. Now they were look, the evidence was telling them that's what the gods wanted. The gods never wanted a priest to be sacrificed. But be that as it may, I'm not here to pass judgment on people in times gone by. When we like to think in these days that we are living in an evidence-based society, such that when we do OC health and safety in a workplace, for example, we make decisions and put in controls and all those sorts of things based on hard evidence. And we find that hard evidence in data. We collect data on risks and all those sorts of things, and we how many first aid injuries in a hospital and all that sort of stuff, how many long-term injuries and all this sort of thing, and we make charts and graphs, and then we make decisions. Well, is that any different from what they were doing back then? But it's just that when they looked at all the evidence as to what was causing the injuries and all that sort of thing, what they could see was that it was the gods causing these injuries, and it was and we might you might say, oh, that's not hard evidence. Well, not when you've got a 21st century hat on, but if you had an 18th century hat on, absolutely it was the gods causing this thing. So if you didn't want a storm, the control you would put in place, if you didn't want a storm coming along and drowning half your pearl fishes and wrecking half your boats, you looked at the data, the hard evidence, and the data, and it was just a matter of fact that the gods were real as they understood them, and this was Sri Lanka, so it'd be all the sort of Indian, Sri Lankan style gods and all that sort of stuff. Okay, and they were causing these storms because they were unhappy. Now this is hard evidence. Now, so it's chauvinistic for us to say, oh no, but we operate on hard evidence now, and they were operating on superstition. But no, they were operating on hard evidence. Things like Brahma, he came up a lot in the opera. He was just a matter of fact. The fact that he was having that he was interfering in nature, making and whipping up storms and all that sort of stuff, that was just a fact. So it wasn't a matter of opinion or anything like that. It was data driven. You could look into any scripture and the data was there, totally proven. All right. Now, here's the thing: if I could time travel, if I could go back in time and be in that era, where go back to an era, go back to a place and a time where something like Zeus, was a matter of fact, such that even there was no reason to question it. It was just fact, as factual as a poll I just ran into because I was making a YouTube clip while I was driving, but I'm not touching the phone. As factual as that. If I could go back to a time when unquestioningly the gods were whipping up storms, for example, and drowning pearl fishes, from time to time because some virgin lifted the veil off her face and showed her face in public. Now, if I went back to a time where that was a matter of fact, number one, I would probably want that girl punished. I feel that I wouldn't think this, but that's me being chauvinistic. If I went back in time, I probably would think this. Now that girl, I would probably, if it was a court of law and all that sort of stuff, she would probably have to be punished for causing that storm because the gods were unhappy. Because she was supposed to be the sacrifice. Now, I'm trying to picture myself back there. All right, this is just fact, and it makes sense. Right, and then I could time travel to now and I say, oh wow, that's blowing my mind. I was absolutely sure that the data I was using was correct. It wasn't anything you would call like superstition or anything like that. And I could come into this time and then I could meet someone, my own descendant if you like, and he could say, see, you were superstitious. Now these days we are in the scientific era and we operate on the hard evidence of our senses, what we can see, measure, what we can see, touch, hear. We operate on all those things, and those things constitute facts. We can know certain things because we have better data than you had in your time back in the 1800s. You had misread the data. You made some obvious mistakes, but you didn't see it. And then the guy would say to me, wow, that's amazing. You measure everything and all that sort of stuff, and then you know what's causing lightning coming out of the clouds and, what's causing storms and all those sorts of things, and what is actually causing pearl fishers to drown from time to time in the workplace. And I say, yeah, data-driven, the evidence of our eyes, our ears, our sense of touch and all that sort of thing, we feed that into computers and then we know certain things like what's causing pearl fishers to die in the workplace. And this other person says, oh, right, we fed all that into our sort of database, and we came up with the fact that it was gods that was causing all of that. And I say, see, that's where you're silly. Like I don't blame you, but, it didn't occur to you to be more sensible like we are. And I would feel very relaxed at that point that my ideas of fact were unassailable. In the same way this guy thought his ideas of facts were unassailable. That's the end of the discussion, really, as far as I'm concerned, really, in my time. But it does get me thinking. Imagine if I could go another 200 years into the future to one of my descendants. All right, so we had this guy back in the 1800s. We've got me now in the 21st century. I'll go to the 23rd century now in a time machine. And maybe there'll be a guy there who'll say, you were operating on the evidence of what you called science, things you can measure. There's this whole other thing that's driving the universe that you didn't even know about. You thought all the physics of the universe, force, matter, time, all these things, all these things you felt you could measure, you thought they were driving the universe and causing the storms, for example, to whip up, And whereas that guy back in the 1800s prayed to the gods and said, please don't whip up the storm, you were measuring things and saying, right, we're going to make sure that, we're going to put controls in place to control the storms. in as much as, we're going to build cyclone-proof bungalows for the workers and all that sort of stuff, and all that sort of stuff. Okay, that's what you did in your era. Oh my God. If only you had known. You see, you thought you were at the end of the process. You thought that guy got it wrong and you had it right because you've got science, that that was primitive back there, and you have arrived at something sensible. But what you didn't know is you were only a stepping stone. There's something else even beyond that you just didn't know about. And it's, X, Y, Z, whatever it is, that's actually controlling space and time and matter and all that sort of stuff and energy. You didn't know about this other thing. This guy way back here actually was closer. He called it the gods, but it's this other thing, X, Y, Z. I don't know what that is, but a whole new physics, of some sort. Here's you tinkering in the 21st century with ideas of space, time, and you trip over and you got a piece of broken concrete, and that's a risk in the workplace. If only you had known that if you had I don't know what that X, Y, Z is, but you could have used the force within you to float over that stone or something, where that broken pavement couldn't be a risk to you, but you just didn't know it because you thought you'd got there. You thought you were at the end of the process. And this all sounds mad, but this guy back here was absolutely certain he was at the end of the process, and that he had it right, that he understood what was causing storms and all that sort of stuff, gods, and now here am I. I'm not that different from him in one way. I think I am, but where I think, physics is driving the storms and all that sort of stuff, and it would be just like that guy got his mind blown when he came into my era. I could get my mind blown by going into a future era, and there might be something underlying the physics and driving the physics, and that we may in that era in the future be able to control that stuff and alter time and space and matter and energy and all that sort of stuff, which all sounds mad to me because I've got all these rules in my head about conservation of energy, but all this sort of stuff, and time, the arrow of time and all that sort of stuff. But I might be able to go into the future and even all the stuff that's falling into my head now, the Back to the Future problems. If there were people in the future that could time travel, why haven't we been seeing them cruising about like tourists for the last 5,000 years, coming back in time, but there might be a good reason for that, which I can't even fathom. But the point is, the good thing about science, I think, is science never, a true scientist never says he knows anything as a fact. What he says is, on the strength of the evidence to hand, I think X, Y, Z, and I don't feel myself to be that much better than that other guy, because he was coming to conclusions also based on his evidence to hand, and that's what I'm doing now. So what a scientist does is allow for the possibility of something, that you've got it wrong, and that's the good thing about it, being a scientist. I'm not really a scientist, but let's pretend I'm a scientist. The good thing about being scientifically minded is you don't think that you're the smart guy and he's the dummy. You recognise that he was analysing his evidence as best he could, and I'm analysing my evidence as best I can. But everything I know, epistemology, everything I know is based on my best efforts at perceiving what I'm looking at, or listening to, or touching, and all that sort of stuff. The evidence, my five senses, I'm trusting them. I know that I'm trusting them, and they could be faulty, and I may find out something really interesting 200 years from now. I think science keeps you humble in a certain way that, like being a preacher can't keep you humble, because a scientist is humble. A proper scientist is humble because he doesn't know that he knows anything for sure. He doubts that he knows anything for sure. That's a better way of putting it. He says, look, I know that force equals mass times acceleration, but that's only on the basis of experiments. One day an apple might fall out of a tree and fall up. It's possible. It's just that it's never been measured before. You know, it may happen. And if it does do that one day, you know, this guy 200 years from now into the future, he might have some new physics by then that can explain that. And he might be able to even tweak time. He might even be able to time travel in such a way as he's come back here and he's sitting in the car right here next to me, but I can't see him, which is absolutely bizarre. But you never know. All right, that's what I'm getting at. I went to the Pearl Fishers last night, and it was an opera, and it was like watching a workplace health and safety show, you know, an health and safety video sort of thing, except it was an opera. And you had all these safety officers trying to keep the pearl fishers safe. And the way they did that was to offer sacrifices and so on to the gods. And what they did was carry out little routines to ward off evil spirits which might whip up storms and cause workplace safety injuries, you know, or death for the pearl fishers of Sri Lanka. And then I went on and on and on, and that'll do for this episode. I could keep going. I could wrap that whole episode up. You know what I was talking about.